a national attention on Mississippi because of the death of Nolan, the football player found on Horn Island after July 4th, and all the racial overtones that come with that. Have you been in touch with investigators in Jackson County and asking for full transparency in that investigation so that the public will know exactly what happened to this young man?
Sean Tyndall, the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, has been in contact with those individuals. Obviously, the autopsy was done by the State Medical Examiner's Office at the Department of Public Safety. I personally know Sheriff John Ledbetter from Jackson County very well. I have not personally spoken to him. I have full confidence that he is going to do his job. And what I will simply say is I don't know all of the details. I don't know all of the facts surrounding the case. I have yet to see a fact or a piece of evidence that suggests any foul play. But if there is, I feel confident that the Sheriff's Office, the District Attorney's Office, the members at the Department of Public Safety that deal with these crimes, if there had been one, they will find it and they will do what is necessary.
Every detail matters. Every clue can change everything. For 13 days, nobody with any real power said a word about this case publicly. Not the governor of Mississippi. Not anyone above a county sheriff. Then, last night, the silence finally broke. And what came out of it made a lot of people angrier than the silence itself ever did. At the time this video was recorded, 13 days had passed since 18-year-old Nolan Xavier Wells disappeared from Horn Island, Mississippi, and this case just had one of its biggest days yet, not because of a single bombshell, but because 4 separate pieces landed almost on top of each other, each one worth understanding on its own before you try to weigh them together. A complete GP's trail of the boat. Confirmation that federal agents are now investigating actual threats connected to this case. Word that more than 60 witnesses have already been interviewed. And finally, the governor of the state speaking publicly about a death that's been front page news for 2 straight weeks. If you're new here, here's the short version. Worth knowing before we get into everything that changed today. Nolan went out to Horn Island on a boat with a group of friends on the 4th of July. At some point that afternoon, his friends say he chose to stay behind to keep talking to a girl, planning to catch a ride back to the mainland with someone else later. He never made it home, and his body was found in the water off the island 2 days later. Horn Island itself sits several miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a barrier island with no permanent residents, accessible only by private or chartered boat, which is part of why piecing together that afternoon has taken this long in the first place. Nobody has been arrested. Nobody has been charged. Before I go any further, I want to be clear that everyone I'm naming today is either speaking publicly in an official capacity or is a private citizen who has not been accused of any crime by law enforcement. This is a summary of what's been reported by credible named outlets, plus my own reaction to it, which is opinion, not a verdict. The GPS data is the single most concrete piece of evidence this case has produced so far, and it finally gives us a full minute-by-minute picture of where that boat was all day, something no memory or Facebook post could ever provide with this level of precision. CBS News obtained the data straight from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. It's a machine logging exactly where the vessel went all day with precision no witness account could match. According to that data, the boat left a private dock at approximately 9:56 that morning and arrived at Horn Island at 11:14 after roughly an hour and 18 minutes on the water. It stayed there through the day and then, according to the GPS, it left the island at 4:31 in the afternoon. From there, it returned to its original departure dock, then traveled into an area called Fort Bayou around 5:52, came back to the dock again at 6:06, and later showed up at the Fort Bayou boat launch at 7:19 that evening. From that point, the data shows the boat traveling over land, which investigators believe means it was being towed by a vehicle all the way to the Biloxi residence of the boat's owners. A previous update here raised the audio from that afternoon's towing call, the one where you can hear someone say, our bilge pump stopped working, we're sinking, can you all please come, as a possible contradiction to Judge Ashley Cole's public account, which says the group left the island around 4:30 after last seeing Nolan around 3. NBC News reported that the audio actually appears to support Cole's account. The boat genuinely did have a bilge pump problem, and the GPS confirms it left Horn Island right around 4:30, exactly matching her timeline. What still isn't resolved is everything about what happened to Nolan specifically in the hours before that departure, which the GPS data, being about the boat and not about a person, simply can't answer. Before this data came out, that entire afternoon existed only in the recollections of a handful of teenagers and secondhand posts online, each version slightly different from the last, which is exactly why a machine-generated timestamp carries more weight than any one person's memory could. That's an important distinction. A GPS tracker tells you where a boat was. It cannot tell you where a person standing on an island was once that person wasn't on the boat anymore. So while this data meaningfully firms up one part of the timeline, the part about the vessel's movements, it doesn't touch the part everyone wants answered, which is what happened to Nolan himself once his friend's boat pulled away from that shoreline. There's also something worth noticing in that later part of the boat's route after it left the island. 5:52 to Fort Bayou, back to the dock at 6:06, then out again to the Fort Bayou boat launch at 7:19, before finally being towed overland to Biloxi. That's a boat that kept moving for hours after leaving Horn Island well into the evening, long before anyone had called the Coast Guard about Nolan at all. People move boats around for all kinds of mundane reasons: refueling, switching docks, coordinating rides for other people in the group. And it is a level of detail nobody had access to until yesterday, exactly the kind of granular, checkable fact this case has needed more of from the very beginning, rather than relying entirely on memory and secondhand Facebook posts. The witness count is the kind of detail that's easy to scroll past, but tells you a lot about how far this investigation has reached. Sheriff John Ledbetter confirmed that his office has spoken with more than 60 witnesses at this point, including all 3 friends who were on the boat with Nolan that day. 60 witnesses is not a small number for a single afternoon on a remote island reachable only by boat. Horn Island draws boaters and day trippers from across the Mississippi Gulf Coast on a holiday weekend like the 4th of July. And reaching that many of them afterward means investigators tracked people down well beyond the small circle of friends named in early coverage. It suggests investigators have been working through essentially everyone who was anywhere near Horn Island on July 4th. Not just this small group of friends whose names have dominated the headlines, and it takes real time and manpower to track down and formally speak with that many people, especially when a lot of them were tourists who simply happened to be on that beach for a holiday weekend and had no idea at the time they'd end up part of a death investigation afterward. Investigations this size take time to synthesize properly, and 60 interviews pushes back against one narrative that's circulated online, the idea that this case has been quietly under-investigated or rushed toward a convenient conclusion. 60 interviews is a lot of legwork for anyone to have quietly ignored. What worries me most today, honestly, more than any single timeline detail covered so far, is this. The FBI confirmed to ABC News that it is, in the Bureau's own words, working to address interstate threats that were received by individuals related to this matter. That statement came directly from the Bureau, not from a spokesperson for Sheriff Ledbetter's office or from the family's legal team, which matters because it means federal law enforcement, not just local or private parties, now considers these threats serious enough to formally address. The agency didn't name who received those threats, but we already know some of the people involved have spoken about it publicly themselves. Judge Ashley Cole has said she's received death threats online since this case exploded into national news. Trassiston Shepard, the friend who's given multiple on-the-record interviews trying to correct the public record, told ABC News directly, "It worries me for my friends, it worries me for my family," when asked about the threats he and others have received. I think it's worth sitting with what that means for a moment, longer than a single headline usually allows. This is a case that started as a grieving family looking for basic answers about their son. 2 weeks later, it's escalated to the point where federal law enforcement is formally investigating threats made across state lines against people connected to it, in both directions. Nolan's family has spent this entire case demanding accountability and transparency. The friends who are on that island have spent it saying they're being threatened for simply having been present that day. Both of those things can be true at the same time. I think they probably are. A case this emotionally charged, this racially fraught, this saturated with speculation from every direction online was always going to attract people who think threats and harassment are an acceptable substitute for actual answers. They're not. Whatever anyone believes happened to Nolan Wells, threatening teenagers and a sitting judge over it, doesn't get this family a single fact closer to the truth. It just adds more danger to a situation that already has plenty. Something uncomfortable is worth naming here too, and it applies to coverage like this just as much as it applies to anyone posting in the replies. Cases like this, one, generate enormous audiences precisely because they're emotional, because they involve real families and real grief and a real sense of injustice, whichever direction you land on. That same emotional pull is exactly what makes threats and harassment spread so easily once a case reaches this level of attention. The volume of attention a case like this generates creates the conditions for a small number of people to cross a line that never should have been crossed in the first place. And it's worth naming that connection plainly rather than pretending this level of national coverage has no downside at all. Which brings us to the biggest story of the day, the one driving most of the reaction online right now. Nearly 2 weeks after Nolan's death, Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves finally addressed the case publicly for the first time. And here's what he actually said, in full, because a lot of the reaction to it has been about the tone as much as the content, and it deserves to be heard in whole rather than as a clipped version. I don't know all of the facts surrounding the case, Reeves said. I have yet to see a fact or piece of evidence that suggests any foul play. But if there is, I feel confident that the sheriff's office, the district attorney's office, the members at the Department of Public Safety that deal with these crimes, if there had been one, they will find it and they will do what is necessary. Reeves also confirmed, as part of that same statement, that he and Sheriff Ledbetter, the man leading this entire investigation, are personally close. There's a version of that statement that's completely reasonable. A sitting governor might not have access to case-specific evidence that hasn't been made public, and saying so is more responsible than pretending to know more than he does. There's also a version of that statement that lands very differently given everything else swirling around this case. This is the same phrase, no foul play, that the sheriff's office used in its very first public comment about Nolan's death, back before any autopsy had even been completed, and that phrase is widely seen as the moment this entire case became a national story about distrust in local authorities in the first place. Hearing the state's top elected official echo nearly identical language, while also volunteering that he's personally close with the man running the investigation, is exactly the kind of detail that reads one way to people who already trust how this case has been handled, and an entirely different way to people who don't. I don't think it's my place to tell you which read is correct. I think it's fair to point out that the governor had 2 weeks to choose his words, and chose ones that echo the exact phrase that's already caused this much public frustration once before. That's not a legal judgment. It's an observation about how carefully or how carelessly public officials tend to choose their language in cases like this one. It's also worth noting what the governor didn't say, which is arguably as telling as what he did. He didn't announce any state resources being directed toward the investigation. He didn't call for a specific timeline on the autopsy results everyone's been waiting weeks for. He didn't address the family directly at all. For a case that's pulled in the Reverend Al Sharpton, the Congressional Black Caucus, national civil rights attorneys, and 2 weeks of continuous coverage from outlets far beyond Mississippi's borders, a brief comment expressing confidence in local officials, without a single concrete commitment attached to it, is going to read to a lot of people as the bare minimum required to stop being asked about it, rather than genuine engagement with a case this significant. It's worth remembering why this detail lands the way it does for so many people, and it connects to something the family itself has said directly. In an interview with Mississippi Today, Christine Wansley described conversations she and her husband had with Nolan throughout his childhood, not just about understanding Black history, but about understanding how differently the legal system in this state has historically treated Black families compared to white ones. Ben Crump has made that same point even more directly. Speaking to a congregation outside Atlanta, he said plainly that Nolan was the only young Black man among 3 white friends, and that if the roles had been reversed, he believes this investigation would already look completely different, with far more aggressive scrutiny placed on whoever was left standing. That's Crump speaking as an advocate for the family, and it's an opinion shared by a lot of people watching this case, exactly the backdrop the governor's comments landed against last night. Mississippi Today is a nonprofit outlet that's covered this case closely from the start, and Wansley's comments to them have been some of the only sustained first-person reporting from inside the family throughout these 13 days. Something else here matters just as much as anything from an official podium, maybe even more in the long run. HuffPost's opinion desk made a point this week that stuck with me since I read it, that Nolan's parents have refused to simply grieve quietly and let this fade, and that their public visibility, along with the protests, the church statements, and the sustained attention from creators like the ones covering this case, is part of a pattern of Black families increasingly refusing to let cases like this one disappear from public memory the way so many once did. That observation helps explain why this case has held national attention for 13 straight days through funeral planning, GPS data drops, and now a governor's carefully worded statement, even without resolving what happened to Nolan on Horn Island. That refusal to stay quiet is what's being tested here. And a lot of people are watching specifically to find out whether it changes how a case like this gets handled. Something has become its own problem inside this case, the same way it has in every update on this case so far. There's content circulating online right now claiming a witness has come forward through a private Facebook message describing secret conversations with investigators and a supposed identified suspect. I looked into that claim specifically. I could not find a single credible named news outlet corroborating any part of it. No name, no verification, nothing beyond a screenshot of a private conversation shared by the person posting it. I'm not going to repeat the specifics of that claim here because repeating unverified details, even to debunk them, tends to spread them further than it contains them. If a claim about this case is coming from an anonymous account, a screenshot with no name attached, or a channel that won't tell you where its information came from, treat it as noise, the same way we've asked you to treat every other unverified claim in this case so far. There's also been content floating around laying out in detail what criminal charges a boat operator could theoretically face under maritime law, treating that legal theorizing almost like it's already been decided. Maritime law generally covers things like negligent operation of a vessel or failure to report an accident, categories that exist for any boating incident anywhere, not because investigators have signaled they're looking at any specific charge in this case. Explaining what a law generally says is background information, nothing more. And any content suggesting formal charges is getting ahead of where this investigation stands. The pieces we've been tracking for weeks now, since the first update on this case, stand at this point. The independent autopsy, funded in part by Colin Kaepernick and conducted in Washington, D.C., still hasn't produced public results. Crump has said preliminary findings are expected soon, likely once the family gets through this weekend. The state's own autopsy remains in the same holding pattern it's been in since Nolan's body was recovered, still without a determined cause or manner of death more than a week and a half after that recovery. A joint examination of Nolan's cell phone, agreed to earlier this week by the family's legal team and the district attorney's office, is still expected to happen, though it hadn't yet taken place as of the most recent update. And Monday is now just 3 days away. That's the day this family lays Nolan to rest. Nolan's homegoing service will be held at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs, with a celebration of his life afterward, exactly as the family announced earlier this week. Ocean Springs sits just across the water from where this all began, and that church has become the gathering point for a community that's been holding vigils and prayer services since the earliest days of this case. Christine Wansley spoke publicly again over the past couple of days, and what she said is the one thing in all of this that isn't a legal theory, a GPS coordinate, or a political statement from anyone. Everything is so heavy, she said. I've just been going through the motions. This pain hits different. She went on to thank everyone for their love and support as she prepares to lay her son to rest on Monday. In a service the whole country now seems to be watching alongside her, I keep thinking about how much technical procedural information has piled up around this family in just the last 24 hours alone. Boat coordinates accurate to the minute. There were federal statements about interstate threats and a governor's carefully worded quote about a phrase that's already caused this much pain once before. In the middle of every bit of that machinery is a mother who's described her grief as simply going through the motions, because that's what's left once you strip away every headline, every statement, and every piece of evidence that's dropped this week alone. This case is going to keep generating updates like today's, pieces of evidence, statements from officials, corrections when earlier reporting turns out to be wrong. All of that matters, and we're going to keep covering it as it comes, but none of it changes what Monday is for this family, which has nothing to do with GPS data or grand juries at all. I want to know what you think about the governor's statement specifically. Does an official simply saying he hasn't seen evidence of foul play yet sound reasonable to you, given where the investigation currently stands? Or does the echo of that exact same phrase from 2 weeks ago make it land differently for you, especially once you factor in his own admission that he's personally close with the sheriff running the case? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I think this is a case where reasonable people are genuinely landing in different places, and I want to hear both sides of it, not just the loudest one. Subscribe if you want to be here the moment either autopsy finally comes back or the moment that phone inspection happens, because this case is still moving fast and we're not stopping until this family gets their answers. Monsters don't exist, but people capable of monstrous things do.